The unification of Egypt around 2950 BC marked the birth of the world's first nation-state. Today, this political and social structure seems almost inevitable. Our economic status, rights, responsibilities, and freedoms are all closely tied to the countries to which we belong. Except for Antarctica, every part of the Earth's surface falls within the borders of one of over 200 countries. But this has not always been the case. Prior to the late 4th millennium BC, states as we know them did not exist. Instead, people identified with their families, local communities, or regional affiliations. The idea of a nation-state was an innovation pioneered by the ancient Egyptians. Starting with Narmer, Egypt's early monarchs governed a completely new type of political entity. This posed a significant challenge: to create a sense of unity among a population scattered from the first cataract of the Nile to the Mediterranean coast. The emergence of a distinct Egyptian identity stands as one of the greatest accomplishments of Egypt's founding rulers. Behind this effort lay a strong element of self-interest. The concept of divine kingship shaped Egypt's civilization, giving rise to its iconic structures like the pyramids, and influencing the construction of monumental tombs and temples that still survive. The prominence of monarchy in ancient Egyptian culture is reflected in the way we classify its 3,000-year-long history, from Narmer's rule to the death of Cleopatra. Unlike other civilizations that are categorized by technological milestones like the Stone or Bronze Ages, Egyptian history is organized by dynastic rule. Fittingly for such a deeply traditional society, this system remains largely the same as the one developed by Manetho, a priest and historian who lived over 2 millennia ago. Using temple records, Manetho divided Egypt's rulers into 30 dynasties, beginning with Menes, identified today as Narmer, the founder of the first dynasty around 2950 BC, and ending with Nectanebo II, the last king of the 30th dynasty. To provide a complete historical picture, modern scholars have added a 31st dynasty to include the Persian rulers who briefly took control of Egypt before Alexander the Great's conquest. The Macedonian and Ptolemaic dynasties, established by Alexander and his general Ptolemy, are not part of Manetho's original framework. Though these later dynasties were of foreign origin and marked a departure from traditional pharaonic rule, they still underscore the ongoing role of dynastic monarchy in Egyptian political life. In line with ancient Egyptian ideology, Manetho's dynastic history presents a continuous line of rulers tracing back to the time of the gods and, ultimately, to the moment of creation. This narrative reflected the official doctrine upheld by the pharaonic court, that the creator god Adam had established the pattern for kingship at the beginning of time, and each subsequent king was a legitimate successor in a divinely ordained tradition. In practice, however, the situation was more complex. During periods of political fragmentation, multiple individuals could claim royal authority in different regions of Egypt. For instance, Manetho's 22nd, 23rd, and 24th dynasties are now understood to have overlapped to some extent. Modern research has also shown that some of Manetho's dynasties, like the 7th, were likely based on misinterpretations of temple records and may not have existed at all. Similarly, the 9th and 10th dynasties probably represent one single ruling family rather than two separate ones. Despite these inconsistencies, Manetho's classification system has remained remarkably resilient. Its continued use today to structure the study of ancient Egypt highlights how central the institution of monarchy was to both his understanding of pharaonic civilization. Kingship, as a system of governance, was fundamentally Egyptian in nature. Among the earliest civilizations, Egypt stood out as the only one to adopt monarchic rule from the outset of its history. In contrast, Mesopotamia was composed of city-states that drew their identity from local temples. There, political and economic authority primarily resided with the high priests. It wasn't until later that a system of monarchy emerged in Mesopotamia, and even then, it never attained the same level of centralization or absolute power seen in Egypt. In the Nile Valley, kings appear to have exercised authority over the people from as far back as prehistoric times. Archaeological digs at the ancient royal cemetery of Abydos have revealed graves dating to around 3800 BC. One of these graves contained a ceramic beaker painted with what may be the earliest known image of a king. The scene depicts a tall figure wearing a feathered headdress, holding a mace in one hand and a rope restraining 3 captives in the other. The portrayal of subdued enemies and the recognizable combination of mace and feathered crown clearly indicate a royal identity, even though the individual likely governed only a small region. Evidence suggests that kingship was simultaneously emerging in other parts of Upper Egypt. A pottery fragment from Nut featuring a crown, along with a grand complex of columned halls near Nekhen, supports this idea of multiple early centers of royal power. By around 3500 BC, the symbolic imagery of kingship had reached a mature form, most notably in a burial site at Nekhen known as the Painted Tomb. The interior of this tomb was adorned with a plastered and painted mural illustrating a royal figure engaged in various ceremonial activities. The most prominent feature is a grand procession of boats, yet in one corner, the king is shown striking down 3 bound prisoners. This striking motif, first seen on the Abydos beaker, became the defining symbol of Egyptian kingship. It reappears on the famous Narmer palette, and continues to be featured in temple reliefs throughout the entire span of pharaonic history. The visual language of early kingship in Egypt was not only powerful but also remarkably persistent. As Egypt transitioned into a unified state, the artistic representation of royal power evolved rapidly, reflecting the shifting concept of kingship. This transformation can be traced through a series of ceremonial artifacts and commemorative carvings. One particularly noteworthy example is the so-called battlefield palette, an artifact similar in form to the more famous Narmer palette but dating to an earlier period. While the Narmer palette highlights the king as a human figure, the older palette portrays the ruler as a massive lion, trampling and impaling his defeated enemies across the battlefield. The purpose was clear: to present the king not merely as a man, but as an overwhelming, natural force. A similar theme appears in a contemporary carving at Gebel Sheikh Suleiman, near the Second Cataract of the Nile in Nubia. This inscription depicts the victorious Egyptian monarch as a giant scorpion, clutching a rope in its pincers that binds a vanquished Nubian leader. From Narmer's own era, an ivory cylinder portrays the king as a ferocious Nile catfish, striking rows of captives with a large club. The symbolism across these examples sends a unified message. Egypt's earliest kings sought to elevate themselves above their people by embracing a godlike persona. This trend reaches its peak with the Narmer palette. Its shape evokes a time when semi-nomadic cattle herders carried their possessions and used their bodies for ritual adornment. In such a society, face paint held significant ritual meaning, and palettes were cherished items. By Narmer's reign, however, the cosmetic palette had been repurposed into a symbolic tool for declaring the king's supreme authority and divine nature. The Narmer palette's design reflects a fusion of 2 worlds. The shallow recess once used to grind cosmetics is now framed by the elongated necks of 2 fantastical animals, known as serpopards. These beings, held on leashes by attendants, do not originate from Egyptian tradition. Instead, they belong to the artistic vocabulary of ancient Mesopotamia. Their presence on an Egyptian artifact highlights a period of vibrant cultural exchange between the Nile and the distant Tigris-Euphrates region. In their efforts to assert dominance and legitimacy, Egypt's early rulers borrowed and adapted foreign symbols. These borrowed elements served their purpose, but once Egyptian culture had developed its own visual language of power, most of these foreign motifs were set aside. The only notable exception was the Mesopotamian-inspired architectural style adopted for royal palaces and administrative buildings. The Narmer palette captures this turning point in Egypt's cultural journey. It marks the moment when Egyptian civilization, having absorbed outside influences, began to define and express its own unique identity. The contrast between prehistoric and historic forms of expression is evident in the portrayal of Narmer himself. On one side of the Narmer palette, he is depicted as a powerful bull, demolishing the walls of an enemy fortress and crushing his foes beneath his hooves. When the palette is turned over, this animalistic imagery fades into the background. Instead, the king appears in human form, triumphant and commanding. While the ideology behind royal power remained consistent, its visual representation underwent a dramatic shift. Depicting the king as a beast was no longer fitting. His newly sanctified status required a more refined and elevated portrayal. Throughout history, monarchs have used ornate symbols to distinguish themselves from ordinary people. Royal regalia often serves as a visual shorthand for the multifaceted concept of kingship. In Christian kingdoms, for instance, a crown topped with a cross signifies the monarch's subordination to divine authority, while a scepter embodies strength balanced with justice. Ancient Egypt used regalia in much the same way, and many of its symbolic items trace back to prehistoric times. The earliest known emblem of authority in Egypt is a simple wooden staff, dating to around 4400 BC. Discovered in a grave at El Omari near modern-day Cairo, the staff was buried beside its owner. This basic instrument of control, a literal big stick, remained a lasting marker of high office in ancient Egyptian culture. However, as the institution of kingship evolved, so too did its symbols. That basic staff gave way to the scepter. One notable example is an ivory scepter shaped like a shepherd's crook, found in a royal tomb at Abydos. This crook became so closely tied to kingship that it was adopted as the hieroglyph representing ruler. When paired with the flail, or goad, it symbolized the dual role of the monarch, to guide and discipline his people. These symbols reflect Egypt's early pastoral society, in which the man who controlled the livestock held authority over the community. This legacy is echoed in another early symbol of kingship. It signified the king's embodiment of the bull's raw strength and dominance, providing a subconscious link to Egypt's pre-dynastic heritage. A crown, of course, is the most iconic symbol of monarchy. Rulers throughout the ages have worn distinctive headgear, not only to set themselves apart but also to elevate themselves above the people. The concept of the crown and even the nation-state may have originated in ancient Egypt. Reflecting their binary worldview, Egyptian kings wore two distinct crowns to represent the two regions of their realm. From the beginning of recorded history, the red crown symbolized Lower Egypt. It featured a short, squared base with a tall rear projection, fronted by a curled extension that resembled an insect's proboscis. The white crown of Upper Egypt, on the other hand, was tall, conical, and ended in a bulbous tip. This division suited Egypt's fondness for dualistic symbolism, but in truth, both crowns likely originated in Upper Egypt. Archaeological evidence suggests that the red crown came from Nut, while the white one emerged further south, near Nekhen. After Egypt was unified, it made political and symbolic sense to assign the red crown to the north, keeping the white one for the south. The Egyptians were masters at constructing traditions to serve national identity. By the middle of the first dynasty, the royal image makers combined the two into a single double crown, representing the king's authority over both lands. From that point forward, Egyptian monarchs had three crown types at their disposal, each suited to highlight different aspects of their power. While art could project royal authority in symbolic form, architecture amplified that message on a grand scale. Like many autocratic rulers throughout history, Egyptian kings were drawn to monumental construction as a way to showcase their might. From the birth of the Egyptian state, the monarchy skillfully used architecture to convey ideology. A specific architectural style was chosen to represent kingship visually. This design, creating dramatic patterns of light and shadow in Egypt's intense sunlight, was originally developed in Mesopotamia during the mid-4th millennium BC. Just as with other cultural borrowings during the state's formative period, this palace facade style found favor with Egypt's early rulers. It had a foreign allure and a commanding presence. As a result, it was quickly adopted for royal buildings, including the palace in Memphis, the new capital and administrative center. This whitewashed palace, known as the White Wall, must have been a dazzling spectacle. Other palaces across Egypt were modeled on the White Wall, transforming this once foreign motif into a signature of Egyptian royal identity. Throughout the history of the pharaohs, both iconography and architecture played vital roles in communicating the ideal image of kingship to the Egyptian populace. These tools were particularly effective in a society where up to 95% of the population was unable to read or write. However, in the ancient world, the most significant threats to royal authority rarely came from the general public. Instead, the individuals a king needed to secure loyalty from were those in his inner circle. This small, literate elite held positions of power within the administration and were uniquely placed to challenge the reigning monarch. That said, these officials typically owed their positions, privileges, and prosperity to royal favor, and thus had a strong incentive to support the monarchy. Nevertheless, Egypt's masterful state propagandists developed a sophisticated strategy to solidify the king's authority among the educated class. Rather than relying on imagery alone, they turned to the written word. Initially, hieroglyphic writing emerged in the late prehistoric period to serve practical functions such as record-keeping and managing resources across Egypt's expansive territory. Yet it wasn't long before the symbolic and ideological power of writing was recognized. The Narmer palette offers an early example. Hieroglyphs are used to name the central figures as well as to describe the depicted events. Language, then, became a powerful means of defining kingship through the use of royal titles. While in today's Western societies most titles have lost their traditional authority, certain designations still echo older systems of deference and hierarchy. In ancient Egypt, by contrast, titles and names carried immense weight. The development of the royal titulary, or formal system of royal titles, was a deliberate and potent expression of the king's divine status. The oldest of these titles, predating even Narmer, was the Horus name. It linked the king directly to the falcon god Horus, the supreme sky deity, thereby portraying the monarch as a living embodiment of divinity on earth. This was a bold, unambiguous assertion. To question the king was to challenge divine order itself. This message permeated all aspects of royal symbolism. Official seals and inscriptions displayed the falcon god perched atop a rectangular frame enclosing the king's Horus name. This frame represented the palace gate, reinforcing the idea that the king, operating within his royal domain, did so under divine authority. A second title emerged during the reign of Narmer's successor, further refining the ideological presentation of the monarch. Written using the hieroglyphs of a vulture and a cobra, it emphasized the divine protection granted to the king. Nekhbet, the vulture goddess, was associated with the city of Nekheb in Upper Egypt, while Wadjet, the cobra goddess, represented the town of Dep in the Nile Delta. By appointing these two ancient deities as joint guardians of the crown, Egypt's rulers ingeniously wove local religious traditions into a cohesive national theology centered on the person of the king. This strategy extended beyond titles. The use of the red and white crowns to symbolize the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt was part of the same ideological project. So too was the elevation of Neith, a Delta goddess, in royal naming conventions. Narmer's wife, for instance, bore the name Neithhotep, meaning Neith is satisfied. In this way, the major religious centers from the northern marshlands to the southern Nile Valley were absorbed into the ideology of kingship. The third royal title, introduced alongside the double crown, further expanded the concept of kingship. Known as Nisibidi, it was composed of two symbols, a reed and a bee. Though their origins are not entirely clear, their combined meaning was rich and multifaceted. This title expressed the king's role as the unifier of opposites. He governed both Upper and Lower Egypt, the fertile lands and the deserts, the domains of the living and the dead. Additionally, the Nisibidi title embodied the core duality at the heart of Egyptian monarchy. It reminded those around the king that he was not only a political leader, but also a divine figure on earth. This fusion of spiritual authority with political power made the king's position virtually unassailable. Throughout history, rulers have naturally understood the unifying power of ceremony and spectacle. Public rituals have always had the ability to generate loyalty and support among the population. The ancient Egyptians mastered these displays from an early stage in their civilization. A richly adorned stone mace head, discovered alongside the Narmer palette at the city of Nekhen, depicts an early ruler known to us as Scorpion performing a symbolic irrigation ritual. In the scene, the king uses a hoe to open a canal, while a subordinate kneels nearby, holding a basket to collect the displaced earth. The presence of fan-bearers, standard-bearers, and female dancers underscores the ceremonial significance of the event. This vivid depiction from Egypt's formative period illustrates how royal rituals were used to highlight the king's role as a bringer of fertility and order. Another mace head from the same archaeological find presents a different, though equally powerful, royal ceremony. This time, King Narmer is shown seated on an elevated platform beneath a canopy, adorned with the red crown and holding a scepter. Flanking him are his usual attendants. Behind them stand guards armed with large staffs, a reminder that even divine kingship required protection. The ceremony appears to focus on military triumph. Spoils of war and captured enemies are paraded before the throne. Nearby, within a walled enclosure, 3 captured antelopes are shown. This ideological parallel between war and the hunt, between the chaos of nature and political rebellion, would continue to resonate throughout Egypt's history. Recent archaeological interpretations of the ancient site at Nekhen offer intriguing new perspectives on early kingship. What had long been identified as a temple dedicated to the falcon god Horus may, in fact, have served a different function, a ceremonial arena for royal rituals. According to this view, the central mound within the enclosed space could have been a raised platform from which the king made formal appearances. The open space before the platform may have been the setting for public ceremonies, such as prisoner parades. If this theory holds, the scene depicted on Narmer's mace head could be an artistic representation of an actual royal event. Additional artifacts from Nekhen suggest that these objects marked and identified ceremonial royal grounds. Extending this interpretation across Egypt, other structures previously labeled as shrines may also have functioned as hubs of royal ritual. In early dynastic records, the king and his actions dominate art and text, with traditional deities playing only secondary roles. This raises a provocative possibility. In the earliest phases of Egyptian civilization, the kings were regarded as gods themselves. Monarchy wasn't just a feature of religion. This merging of divine kingship and ritual continued to shape pharaonic culture for millennia, but it came with a grim undertone. Looking again at the Narmer and Scorpion mace heads, the objects themselves reveal something fundamental about Egyptian royal authority. Since prehistoric times, the mace has symbolized power, likely because it is an unmistakable weapon of force. The choice to associate maces with kingship speaks volumes about the underlying nature of Egyptian rule. The scenes carved on the Narmer palette further reveal the brutality at the heart of royal power. On one side, Narmer is shown wielding a mace, about to strike down an enemy. On the reverse, the king is depicted surveying the aftermath of his victory, rows of headless corpses, each mutilated in a deeply degrading way. The victims' severed heads and genitals are placed between their legs. Disturbing though it is, this imagery suggests that such treatment of defeated foes was not exceptional in Narmer's Egypt. At the highest tier of Egyptian society, the king personified a relentless and unforgiving authority. Although he was often portrayed as the divine unifier of the land, a godlike figure who upheld cosmic order, royal imagery left no doubt that preserving this order involved ruthlessly destroying those who threatened it. Narmer and the kings who came before him had seized control through force, and they made no secret of their readiness to use violence to maintain it. The monarchy's visual propaganda was intentionally aggressive. It served both as a pledge of protection and a stark warning. One of the most disturbing images from early Egyptian art appears on the top section of the scorpion mace head. This band of decoration features a series of royal standards, each representing a different facet of the king's power. However, these standards double as gallows. In hieroglyphs, the lapwings symbolize the ordinary populace, known in ancient Egyptian as rikit, in contrast to the elite class that held real influence. On this mace head, the common people are literally shown being executed under the emblem of royal rule. This theme would reappear in later periods. For instance, the base of a statue of King Nedrikit, or Djoser, is adorned with carved bows and lapwings, suggesting that the king symbolically crushed both his foes and his own subjects underfoot. While many Egyptologists have recoiled at the symbolism of such imagery, its implications are undeniable. Absolute power is often maintained through coercion, and ancient Egypt was no exception. Perhaps the most chilling reflection of this harsh rule is found in the burial practices of Egypt's earliest monarchs. At Nut, an elite tomb dating to around 3500 BC contained more than lavish grave goods. Scattered around the chamber were human leg bones, and in its center, a collection of skulls. These remains belonged to individuals who had clearly been dismembered and buried with the tomb's owner. At Nekhen, several pre-dynastic burials show signs of scalping and decapitation, while at Adima, 2 bodies were found with their throats cut before beheading. One archaeologist initially suggested these might represent early cases of ritual self-sacrifice, where loyal retainers chose death to follow their master into the afterlife. However, burials from the First Dynasty at Abydos present a more unsettling reality. Royal tombs from this era included rows of subsidiary graves belonging to members of the king's court. In one example, every individual was young. Another tomb, from the end of the dynasty, featured a single roof covering both the king's burial chamber and the surrounding servants' graves. Such uniformity in death makes it impossible to believe these were natural deaths or voluntary suicides. Though once thought to be self-sacrifice driven by loyalty, more recent studies have shown that many of the bodies exhibit signs of strangulation. The conclusion is both grim and undeniable. Egypt's earliest rulers wielded absolute control over life and death, and they exercised that power to reinforce their dominance. For the average person, life meant subservience. For those within the king's inner circle, it meant living under constant threat. Neither path offered much comfort. The practice of retainer sacrifice reached its height relatively early in Egypt's history. The tomb of Jur, the third pharaoh of the First Dynasty around 2900 BC, was encircled by 318 subsidiary graves. It appears that, having secured absolute authority, Egypt's rulers were eager to exercise it fully. Those laid to rest alongside the king included not only human attendants but also his pets. That both dogs and concubines were considered fitting companions in death reveals much about the perceived worth of royal servants at the early Egyptian court. Following the reigns of Jur and his successor Jet, the custom of sacrificing retainers began to wane, and came to a complete halt by the close of the First Dynasty. However, one might question whether this shift was driven more by practicality than by changing moral views. Eliminating an entire group of trained servants at the end of each king's reign was a significant loss of skilled individuals. Evidence of human sacrifice also appears on labels from royal tombs. These small tags, once attached to containers of offerings, are etched with scenes of royal events. 2 such labels, seemingly linked to the same ritual, depict a bound man kneeling beside a large basin. Another figure stands over him, gripping a long knife, clearly poised to deliver a fatal blow. Though no inscriptions accompany the images, the purpose of the scene is unmistakable: the ceremonial killing of a human captive, most likely as part of a ritual connected to kingship. The royal tomb, through its contents, and the attendants buried nearby, was meant to ensure that the king could continue performing his ceremonial role for eternity. It became the cornerstone of kingship, and from the dawn of ancient Egypt to the end of the Pharaonic era, each reign's most significant building endeavor. Preparing the king's burial demanded immense resources. It's often said that Egyptians undertook this task willingly, seeing it as their contribution to a covenant that secured the nation's well-being and survival. But this interpretation, unsurprisingly, originates from the monarchy itself. Promoting the idea that the king embodied unity and national prosperity served his own agenda. In truth, the king's motivations were largely self-serving. The royal necropolis at Abydos, where the ruler's tomb was surrounded by those of his followers, physically reflected the structure of Egyptian society. The development and enforcement of this ideology played a pivotal role in shaping pharaonic civilization, but it came at a heavy cost. With Egypt's unification, the steady advance of centralized state control had begun in full force.